tariffs, right? And there's a lot of people writing about it, talking about it, what's the repercussions of it and everything.
It's a very confusing environment. There's many different things being said in the media.
I understand what the news are saying about it, but this is how it really is going to potentially impact your day. So hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is Steve Taylor, as always, the lead advisor over here at Merited Wealth, and thanks for joining us on the Do It For Yourself podcast. And today I'm really happy, really excited to have a really long-time friend and really what I'm going to call like an expert in this topic we're going to talk about here to join us. And this is really something that's been coming up a lot lately. It's a lot in the news. It's taken up the news cycle tremendously. As we speak, today it's February 13th, and there's even more in the news about this topic. But what we're talking about today is tariffs, right? And there's a lot of people writing about it, talking about it, what's the repercussions of it and everything. And so I thought it'd be a great idea to bring an actual business owner who's dealing with these tariffs issues. They've dealt with them in the past, they're dealing with them today, and really kind of walk through to really understand, okay, I understand what the news are saying about it, but this is how it really is going to potentially impact your day, and this is how it's impacting our small businesses. So without further ado, please, Manny, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do.
Sure. My name is Manny Gennard. I own a Creative Home and Kitchen. We are a housewares importer and distributor who sells major retail chains such as Macy's, Ross, Burlington, CVS, HEB, Publix, and many others, from grocery chains, Amazon on the comp side of the business, as well as many independent stores and distributors in the U.S. And we focus primarily on the U.S. market. Our business has a lot of categories. We do from seasonal products to housewares like cookware, pots and pans, kitchen tools and gadgets. We do cleaning products and a little bit of everything. We're in a lot of different categories, which is it's dynamic in this kind of environment right now. There's so many different variables happening on the sourcing side. And my background, I've been in this industry since 1995. I started a family-owned business, and eventually we were pioneering Hispanic cookware and kitchenware in the U.S. retail market back when that was the buzz, late 90s and early 2000s, when it was really capturing the essence of U.S. retail across all channels, from music to food to health and beauty care items, houseware items, clothing. And it was kind of like that emerging category with that retail. And we represented many brands at the time from Latin America and Central America. And we eventually partnered with our largest vendor and brand, which was Imusa. We started Imusa USA, which is a Colombian company. We were partners in that business, and we established the brand in the U.S. market across all retail channels. Really kind of was a dynamic time at retail, and they were segmenting these products at all stores across the nation. And we ended up selling our company to Group Seb back in 2011, which was a multinational brand they have many brands. You're familiar with them, like Allclad, Tefal, Rowenta, and they were very interested in our business model. They purchased us back in 11, and I retired from them in 2014. I took a year off a sabbatical and started up on my own again, doing what I enjoy most, which was sourcing and developing products for the U.S. retail channel. And after being in the business so long, it was a great opportunity to continue that passion. So here we are. We're at our showroom here in Doral, and Steve had approached me to talk about this. I thought it was a great idea just because it's a very confusing environment. There's many different things being said in the media. There's a lot of comments, and there's a lot of different variables in this as well. I think that there's several layers of this that people do not understand at a granular level. And we're hopefully going to be able to dissect some of that and give you some perspective. And, specifically in our business, that we are developing and sourcing products from all over the world, it brings an interesting perspective as to being in the consumer products industry and how we develop products and put them at retail. These are things that directly impact us every day. So we have a good experience of, what is taking place. And I can't speak to a lot of the macro other things, but I could definitely comment on them anecdotally and opinion based. And we have a lot of fact based things here that we'll be able to share that as of these tariffs have been coming out. And this is the second time it happens, obviously. So in the recent 10-year time frame. So I think it'll
Sounds
be a
great.
good opportunity.
Yeah, sounds great, man. So let's start here, man. I really want to, because like as you said, you've been in the business a long time. This is a family business, right? And you said what you said most pointedly was you enjoyed the aspect of sourcing, right? Going out and
Yeah.
finding the product. So it's I know, in all those iterations of your business, you have been traveling and sourcing products out of China for a long time. Walk us through a little bit about, maybe the time frame when you started doing it, kind of how it was just on the sourcing and dealing with China, and really how it's maybe kind of changed and modified over the years as you've been doing this, so people understand that.
Sure. Yeah, I think originally back when we were visiting China in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was a very different landscape. China was still emerging as a global manufacturer. There was actually still at that time a lot of manufacturing in Hong Kong per se, which is no longer the case. They had joined the WTO. I think China as a country, as an industrial country, was evolving. There was a lot of emerging factories. I think the government was very instrumental in that because they had at that time a rebate program for a lot of the factories who were exporting across to other nations, specifically in the US. So what that means is they would have, depending on the product, on the commodity, the industry, they would have a rebate that they would get when they shipped a product across the ocean. So that factory would submit it to their local government and to the government. I'm not sure how that process went, but they would get a rebate back. So that ranged from anywhere from 3% to 12%. And that was based on invoice value. So the cost was, $50,000 for a container, and they got 5% rebate, they would get 2,500 back. So it was almost kind of like a subsidy. It was to help them in that process. And over time, that was kind of diminished and it kind of went away. I guess like a digressing incentive that the government had given. And I think in that time frame too, the factories evolved a lot. I think that there's been probably pre-COVID, there was a emerging factory group that, an industry of factories that, there was a lot of labor. And I think there was an abundant amount of labor within the market. And I think COVID kind of changed that. I think that it kind of changed that dynamicism of a lot of the factories where they really ramped up production because the demand was so high. There was so much money in the market that obviously impacted a lot of our inflation that we're living today. All that stimulus money that was in the market, people were buying product, buying everything and anything that they could get their hands on. That had another impact, which was obviously everybody read about the high freight costs when they were, $20,000 container rates. And going back, those factories, I believe that in China, the industries changed where they really expanded those factories.
Let me
And
ask Manny real quick,
sure.
going back, you said the government initially would rebate to incentivize them, right, to do this trade, and you're saying that went away. Was that because they felt the factories didn't need them, or did they not want them to trade with certain countries? Was there a particular reason why that the
No,
incentives and the rebates went away?
I think it was because they had already created a certain volume and they had eventually, I guess it was kind of like that crutch that they needed to get going and to be
Mhm.
more competitive in the marketplace and to kind of take over market. And at the same time, the truth of the matter is a lot of the industries and our particular industries, meaning aluminum, steel, and other things that we purchase, and day-to-day commodities like cookware, for example, a lot of those factories are government owned. So they have basically their own exchange rates, where the world kind of goes on the London Metal Exchange. They have their own commodities and commodity rates that either may mirror or may be different than what's happening at the time in the market. They kind of control their own destiny in that case. And I think that that's based on their demand, on their supply, and what they choose to do. So some of those things, when you look at the supply chain level, it's not where other countries, for example, kind of like understanding the global part. When we started in this business, our number one supplier for fry pans, believe it or not, was Italy. We used to buy tons of product from Italy and Spain that they manufactured a lot of those fry pans and a lot of those typical aluminum cookware items and stainless steel. Not so much, but they did have some. And through time, when they joined the euro, that these countries were no longer their own currencies, such as a lira or the peseta in Spain, the peso, that they joined the European Union, and they went ahead and they all joined that whole common currency. That began to kind of took away from the competitiveness of the market, because at that point they couldn't devalue their currencies like they used to. And Italy was a longtime supplier for years, until obviously they couldn't compete anymore because they were getting much more expensive. And then obviously markets like India and in China began emerging as the primary competitors in those categories.
Let me ask
So,
Manny about that, because
sure,
this is interesting. I don't really, go back how I would say switch. I mean, so China, let's focus on China for purpose of the
sure,
discussion, right? Because that's like the biggest issue
the
with
biggest one.
tariffs and items like that. So China, when they were getting their metals in the aluminum industry, did they have to import the actual metals to build the
No.
cookware, or they have it all there?
They have it all there. They have
Okay.
fully integrated manufacturing. So they have the way to mill it and mine it and to make it a lot of the factories obviously don't do that, but they have the sourcing capacity where they can they have those materials locally, and then at that point they can buy from the different, you know, raw material manufacturers, which are not that many, but they do exist.
Right.
And obviously those components are available to them at that. So they definitely have a competitive edge in that sense. And
Okay.
if it has it's very similar to a lot of the entities in China. They have some type of government involvement. So the government will be owning some of that, or if not all of it. So they can definitely weigh in on, look, if we choose to make this product more competitive, or they choose to not make it competitive, it's really in their hands. And that's an advantage from a manufacturing standpoint for sure.
That's really interesting, man. So walk us through, you said you started the late thousand, the late 90s, early 2000s, and China was just emerging. At what point in time did it kind of switch where they became really competitive? And maybe you saw, particularly in your
Sure.
industry, that I believe there was a time where you were almost getting almost all of your product for China, right? I don't know if that's changed now or not.
We still have a very strong South American base. We bring in a lot of product from South America and from
Okay.
India. I would say our we're probably still 45 or 50%. I would say 45% from other countries and 55% from China, overall in our imports and our buys. And that's really category specific, meaning that certain categories are very competitive in certain Latin American countries or Indian countries where they have a competitive advantage. So I'll give you an example. India is excellent at making stainless steel. They're very good at it. They're very good at milling it and procuring it and manufacturing it from a raw material level all the way through the finished product. And they're actually more competitive than China in many cases. So they have a competitive advantage let's say in that category, in that industry, specific to our products.
Interesting.
Versus China may have a little bit different materials and maybe a little bit better quality, but it's hard for them to compete in the, let's say, the good, better, best range. If you're looking at it from a marketing hierarchy of products, they have a tough time competing in that. So,
Understand.
understanding how really that works is, I would say overall in China, probably in the mid to late 2000s, I would say later 2000s, 2008, 9, 10. That's when really I think China began taking over a lot of the businesses. And then eventually, once we got into, the 2015, 2014, they maintained that. And I think that's where, right before COVID, kind of changed the dynamicism of all the manufacturing in China. And I think the world changed at that point, I think overall in terms of sourcing. But in that interim, at some point, and I don't have the exact date, but it was in that interim where a lot of those rebates started diminishing and going away.
Got it.
And at least category specific to our vendors, in a lot of cases, they don't have those anymore. And they've been away from them for many years. But the COVID phenomenon brought an interesting and this all kind of plays into the tariff
Yeah.
situation too, which is, during COVID, a lot of the factories really ramped up production. There was a global demand, obviously, for many products, right?
Well, let's
And
step back. Let's go
sure.
prior to COVID, right? Let's kind of walk
Mhm.
through as you've outlined, really great. You're saying those rebates, really slowed down around 2014, 2015. China was a bigger player in the market. They had emerged in your particular business. Let's call it roughly half. So let's go back to around that time, right? When President Trump's first administration, right, this comes
Sure.
out. And I believe, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, maybe in your history, or maybe it's not. That might be the first time where, I don't know if it's tariffs in their entirety or significant tariffs start to present themselves. So, let's go around that time when these tariffs, start presenting themselves. When you start hearing the discussions of it, and then they come down, what do you, as a business owner, what are you thinking when they're talking about the tariffs coming? And then number two, when the tariffs actually come, how does that affect what you guys are doing on a day to
Absolutely.
day and changing your prices?
Well, it's interesting because this is not the first time, this wasn't the first time we dealt with tariffs. So, and it wasn't really tariffs per se, it was trade agreements because that was the popular term back before that. So going back to when President Clinton was in office, when President Bush was in office, there was a lot of trade agreements with Asian nations, with South America, with Central America, with specific countries that they would get an incentive to do trade with the US, and they would not be taxed or tariffed or duty. Let's put it in two different parts. Duties are what typically we pay. A tariff is kind of like the penalty. Let's think of it that way, right? So duties have always existed. There's always been duties across all nations, whether it's the US, Mexico, Colombia, doesn't matter where you go. Everybody has their own duties and tariffs that protect their local industries. So I'll give you an example specific to our products. We cannot sell a China-made product in Mexico without paying 100% tariff.
Wow.
So if you bring in a Chinese fry pan to Mexico, there is 100% tariff if it's made from aluminum on that product. And that product will pay that tariff to protect the local industries, which are two or three manufacturers in Mexico. So this is something that's common among all of Latin America. And you see it depending on these Latin American nations protecting their local manufacturing and industries. So when you step back a little bit and you say, well, and on my era through those years, sometimes the trade agreements would expire. So all of a sudden, from one day to the other, it would expire and we would be hit with a 3% tariff or a duty, depending on what the agreement was at the time, 5%, 10%. And until that was approved again by Congress or by the Senate, we were paying it. So it was an immediate absorption and there was no way around it. So at that point, you had to step back and renegotiate with your factories. Some of them would eventually get renewed and we would get that paid back. In other cases, they wouldn't get renewed.
So you would say
So
absorption, Manny. So in those scenarios, right, where it came kind of unexpected like that, would you pass that cost on the consumer, or you just
no.
said, "Hey, listen, it's uncertain. Let's just absorb it for now, and let's kind of wait and see."
Typically in our business, and back then even more, you had to give a retailer 90 days, 120 days to pass along an increase. So a lot of these things, unfortunately, they were very last minute because they had at the time to renew it if it was in the budget or if it was in one of their, typical law sessions. And if it didn't make it or if it didn't get reviewed, it would basically pass. It would be set to expire. It would go out basically to expire out. And that would immediately, that duty would start kicking in. So we would have to pay it. Now, there was always, the nations, it was beneficial for them to obviously want to negotiate this trade pact. A lot of times it wasn't because there was bad rhetoric. It was just because it wasn't, let's call it important, right, at the time. So you would have to either absorb it in your margins, or if you felt that it was something that wouldn't be renewed at that point, you'd have to negotiate with your factory to say, hey, listen, how much will you absorb? How much will I absorb? And then go back to the retailer and say, was it material enough for us to absorb it? So if it was something nominal, 2, 3, 4, 5%, more than likely you would probably absorb it through the supply chain or through the factory and yourself to not pass that along. If it was something material where it was 20%, then you may have to go back and revisit that and then put those price increases in and make those decisions. But that was really a case by case basis. But this has been going on for quite some time. This is not the first time it happens. It wasn't let's call it the two terms a tariff. It was different trade agreements that existed. And some of those are still in today. I think there's still some of those that do exist. And that's part of what we do today as a U.S. trade and commerce with some of these countries.
Right.
Fast forward to what we're talking about today, or actually to 18, 19, when Trump's tariffs came in, there was products that obviously were hit nominally, that some categories of products didn't get hit at all. It was very selective about how they did it. So for example, we sell cookware. So if the product was uncoated, meaning that it didn't have like a nonstick coating on it, it did not get impacted by any tariff. If it had a nonstick coating on it, it was 7.5%. And in some cases, for example, your typical can opener you buy at the grocery store for a couple of bucks, that was 25%. So everything had a different category and a different price. And,
Why is that, Manny? Well, I mean, I guess maybe you could speculate here. Why is that's really interesting that it is by
yep.
product, and it's really those are dramatic percentages, right? I mean, obviously a
Yes,
pan isn't as
some of them
expensive
were
as a
dramatic.
bottle opener, but why would you guess, or why would it be so? I mean, that's so unique in that sense that it really could affect one business much greater than the other depending on product.
Some of them were used to protect certain industries in the US where some of these products were being made. For example, obviously you had, for example, Corning Glass, where they make Pyrex up in New York. Those were industries that were protected with additional tariffs on glass coming in. And then you look at specifically like a can opener or kitchen tools and gadgets. There was really no rhyme or reason for those, but I think that's where people began to realize like the shift from the dollar stores. So like a Dollar Tree or Family Dollar or Dollar General couldn't sell a dollar can opener anymore. They had to sell for 125. Right, because that increase went up to that. So some of these were just, I think, low hanging fruit, were the sense that there's really no other country in the world that can make a 40-cent, 50-cent can opener. You know what I mean? Other than China. That's just the reality. It's mass produced. It's very high volumes, low margins, and they're very everyday function items that, if somebody pays a quarter more for them, it's not a big deal.
Right.
And there's really no manufacturing for that. And that was why they targeted some of these categories. I don't know specifically, but I do know that some of them were industry specific to manufacturing in the US. And I think they kind of pinpointed at that time. I'm not sure strategically how or why, but they did it. And then, of course, at that time we had to deal with, as an importer and as a distributor, remember, we're selling all these massive retailers, which are also buying direct, right? I think that at that point you have the option to, if you're an importer like a Walmart or a Target and you're buying direct from factories in China and you're faced with this 25%, it's very difficult to mitigate that at the factory level. So typically those just either they pass along the chain, right? They just increase the cost and it went to the, but I think at that time it was very, very thoughtful, where many of the retailers that were selling a lot of these opening price point type products that were very inexpensive and very dollar driven, they kind of said, hey, listen, this is an opportunity for us to kind of step up the products. And I think overall the market and our industry changed, where a lot of the products they took advantage at that point to re-engineer them, make them better design, a little bit better functions, better materials. And then you started seeing the price point go from, instead of it $1 to $1.25, they brought a product that was like $1.99, right? And that's something that was a little bit better look, a little bit better material. So I think it was a good opportunity for the US retailer to get the customer away from that dollar, because just from a dollar and cent standpoint, it was very difficult for them to make money on that dollar item, making 20 or 30 cents when they can make on a $2 item 60 cents. And frankly speaking, they were going to still get that. That was still, let's say, the cheapest option in the store. People were going to buy it. So
Yeah.
it was that time frame where I think, from specifically in our industries, that people started re-engineering a lot of the products and changing them and making them better in a lot of cases, and re-upping the assortments in the stores.
Now, Manny, when they did that, though, were they going back to the same kind of, let's call it, country of origin for that re-engineering, or were they switching where they were getting the products from?
Yeah, I think for sure. I think like, again, like I go back to, I hate to say this, but they make the best the cheapest and best can openers, right? So the reality is there really wasn't anywhere else to buy it. And I think in other cases, it really helped our South American factories. So for example, some of these products that were having historically great sell-throughs in the US being made in Latin America that had a lot of manufacturing in our specific industries, they were able to be competitive again because obviously with some of those costs, they have a different, Latin America has a very similar manufacturing standard to what we have in the US. Same kind of similar OSHA standards, same similar worker standards. They have, basically a lot of the same things that we do if we manufacture here. So they have a higher standard, they have higher labor costs, they have, higher material costs, because in some cases they have to import from other parts of the world to make the items. So it was a great opportunity for them. And it was kind of like a resurgence for Latin America. I saw probably our biggest growth from Latin American vendors, which was really positive because I think, leading up to COVID and past COVID, we realized that it's really important to have multi-levels and different
Yeah.
manufacturing, that we can't be so dependent on one country because that could cause us catastrophic things. And I'm talking just from simple basics, from medicine to masks, and I mean, so many different things that we were impacted by that we had forgotten that we just outsourced them everywhere else. So I think it
Yeah.
was one of those unique situations that, when those tariffs happened in that, I think it was 18, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah,
or
going
19.
back to 18 or 19,
Yeah.
like what exactly did you guys do? You saw it coming. What did you do and what was the result of that?
Yeah. I mean, here's the overall reality for us as a business. When a tariff was 25%, there was really only two options, or three, let's call them three options. A, you have to pass along the price increase, and there's really not much you can do. B, you can re-engineer the product. You can either spec it down to try to make it less expensive. And that's kind of like the shrinkflation that you heard about and read about and saw, that people were changing products to make them less expensive and to offset that, right? And then the third thing is to re-engineer it, is make it better, right? And then change the whole product, make it better compositions, change the dynamic of the product in the sense that its function or its finish or its material, to try to kind of replace it and give it a much better option for that customer or that retailer. So there was always those different. There really wasn't a median thing for 25%. Now, where we are today, and similar to where we were then when it was like 7.5% on some of these items, or 10%, at that point you had to really work with. At that point, the typical retailer, your large, retail chain, whether it's a grocery chain or whether it's a mass merchant or a department store, is going to tell you, hey, look, I don't want to take any of this. We may take 1% or 2%, but you have to absorb the majority of it. So at that point, you go back to the supply chain, right? You have to reinvent yourself. You got to talk to the factories, see what they're going to do, see what kind of rebates you're going to do. And at that time, if you remember, China did a devaluation in their currency to help offset that. So they went back and they said, hey, we're going to do this devaluation. And it was like, if I'm not mistaken, it was like 4 or 5% over a period of time, that they kind of adjusted their currency, the yuan, to help their manufacturers sell in the US. So if you don't have an export license from China, if you're a China exporter, or if you don't have a Hong Kong bank account, you're going to have to get those dollars you're going to get paid in local currency. So they're going to export in US dollars, but they're going to get paid in local currency. They don't get it paid in dollars. So that devaluation really helped them to be more competitive. So they put some of those in there. Then on the other side of it was the factory just saying, hey, listen, I'm going to eat some of this margin to keep my volume. I'll give you a discount of 3 or 4%. So if you added those two up, it was like maybe 7, 8% that you're able to get in discounts in total, and maybe you absorb 2% or 3%, and you didn't pass anything along to the retailer. So it was really a unique time that it kind of makes you get better at what you do, because the reality is every day that you kind of do day-to-day work and you kind of forget about those things, but you go back and renegotiate your freight rates, check your efficiencies, see all your hard costs, your fixed costs every month, or variable costs that are related to shipping these products and getting them in the country, and then where you can actually mitigate that. So that was, you didn't see a lot of price increases for
Right.
those categories of products. I think the big impacts are when you see the 25%. That's when it's really difficult to pass it along, because the factory doesn't have it. Typically, the importer doesn't have it. And at that point, you have to go ahead and say, hey, how am I going to make this happen? Right. And I think overall, that's during that era, was really unique, that you started seeing a lot of that happening. And in some categories, like I tell you, it was kind of painful, I think, in the sense that it was just a process where you have to go, when you're dealing with certain products and you're dealing with 1,000 items or 500 products, and you're having to go with each of those and kind of renegotiate them. It's like you have this really short window to do a lot of these products and renegotiate them all at one time, which is kind of similar to what we're doing right now. But
Yeah. And I would tell
it's
you, man, going through this conversation, it really reminds me of a lot of the conversations we had, for a lot of
sure.
people out there that probably don't know. My wife and I got into a business and started developing a product to
Tech.
sell a number
Yeah.
of years ago, the Tech, right? We got the Shark Tank and all that good stuff. But it was interesting as we were going through it, and then as we were learning about, I didn't know, and we know anything about this, right? You look
Yeah.
at what's your manufacturer costs, then you go to distributors versus retail and all the like. And really what everyone really hammered in, and I would say we didn't do that. My wife was more on top of this than me, and I'm the guilty of this, that whatever the initial margin that you set in your product, if you are in a buy from somewhere and sell, retail environment, you have to keep that margin up because you never know what's going to happen, right? If you go to
100%.
the big sellers, they might give, try to get the discounts or tariffs or anything like that. So it really reminds me, and if anybody's out there, if they're thinking about getting into one of a business like yours, is right, that margin, when people start saying it, I was told it's like, if you make it, the hard cost is $5, the retail has to be 20, right? You have to give yourself at least double it to get to wholesale
Sure.
or more, and then retail at 20. So when people are selling their prices, on that, you really have to keep your margin there. But so you're saying in 28, 18 and 19, as you just went through, it kind of, you absorbed it, you figured it out different ways. So yeah, I remember us not feeling that. So then you keep saying and talk us through, how COVID changed so much in
Oh my God.
your
It
business
changed
in
everything.
general, and
Yes,
maybe trade
absolutely.
agreements or everything it is. So as we go through COVID and come out of COVID, how are your pricing issues looking now? And then, not even now that we get forward to today that the new tariffs come in, but how did that change during COVID and why?
COVID was just obviously an anomaly that everybody's now reflecting in hindsight. You kind of look back and do this analysis as to what happened prior to that, right? And it kind of like the world was fine. We had fixed all that, all those other, I think overall for retail, it was a really positive uh, in our industry specific, very positive, because I think there was a betterment, if you can say, in the retail landscape where there was better products being distributed. You didn't see a lot of that cheap tchotchke stuff anymore. Some of the retailers had to finally take up their price points, and I think that was good. I think that was healthier for overall businesses, for margins, for everything else. And at the same time, it kind of brought a little bit better product to the marketplace, which is always good. And there's products for everything, but I just look at this in a good, better, best strategy. I think overall it was a unique time, and it really made our industry get better at what we did. And like everything, there's always challenges, but it helped overall bring some diversity to more manufacturing. You started seeing Italian manufacturers back in, suppliers from Turkey, India, Latin America. I was buying from Mexico, El Salvador, Colombia. We'd even brought some product in from Brazil. I mean, we were really trying to get multifunction on this, because it by those tariffs did allow us to get, hey, we got within a 10 or 15% price range of a lot of product being made from another origin point, and the retailers were really getting warmed up to that, right? So fast forward goes, and then COVID comes, and there was that the first part of COVID was very uncertain. The first several months were very difficult, because as an importer, there was parts of the world that were closing at different times. So China was really the first country to close up. They had closed down the country, no manufacturing, no nothing. The retailers were canceling orders left and right because they were unsure as to what was going to happen. It was a very uncertain time. And as the year progressed and they started bringing in some of these stimulus monies to prevent the economies from crashing, and then all of a sudden, when people started getting all this money, they're like, hey, I have all this excess cash. I'm going to start buying stuff that I wanted to replace for a long time. And that happened across every home, every house, cars, you name it. It just happened at different stages, right? So the resurgence of manufacturing country by country was different because it depended on what they were going through at the time in terms of COVID cases and if they were closed down, if they were open. So it was a really dynamic time because you could be manufacturing in a certain country, then all of a sudden they're closed down for 3 months or 2 months because of a certain, that factory got hit with cases, and then they would shut down the area for a month to make sure to see that nobody would get contaminated. And, this is obviously we're thinking about mid 2020 through end of 2020. So it was kind of like a very unstable time in trying to get product. And then obviously once the money started happening, inventory started getting depleted across everybody. It was as fast as you can get product, you could sell product. And that was a challenge. I think we grew in 21 from 20. It was like close to, I don't know, 60, 70% from previous year. It was
Wow.
insane. And we
Yeah.
could have grown more. But the negative of that is the China was up and running. Most of the countries were up and running. There was flush with money across the globe. It wasn't just specific to the US. I think it was everywhere. It had some type of incentive for the people to have some type of, depending on when they were impacted with closed countries, and they would get some type of stipend or benefit from the governments. It really started driving a lot of business, to each economy and each global market. So manufacturing was at all-time high. I think all the factories were opening up production lines. China more so than any other place, because I think in Latin America and other places they still had they had to watch their shifts, and because they didn't want contamination across different let's say production times where they were 12 hour intervals, so they'd have one shift at one time, another shift at another time. So some countries were more let's say more aggressive in not letting them expand, where other ones were like, hey, let's just blow this up and we're going to ship as much as we can, make as much as we can. And that's what really drove a lot of the inflation in the country at the time, because the steep ship lines could not keep up with the capacity. They started raising the container rates from, I think we started in 2020, we were paying close to like $2,000 or $3,000 for a container. By the end of 2020, we were like at $9,000 a container. Yeah. By the end of 2021, we were paying $20,000 to $21,000 for a container. Wow. So, on a product line, if you think about it, a container of, let's say, fry pans or cookware, maybe a $30,000 or $40,000 in container value. When you add just $20,000 of freight, that's half the value of the product that has to go just to the freight companies. Right. So the freight companies were making, they had a banner years. I mean, that's factual. Everybody can check that out. It was insanity, the amount of profits that they were taking based on that opportunity. And I think that really hurt a lot of the economy in terms of inflation. It was a significant part of a lot of those, and specific to our industry specifically. It was
How
really
did it work through
impactful.
to you? Like in that instance, right? That's another unexpected cost of freight.
There's no way you
would
just
you just pass it on.
Pass it along, and it really wasn't. It was a unique time because there was the retailers couldn't get enough product. So there really wasn't a lot of argument on that. And quite frankly, you also had the chance to make a better product because people were paying up for something because they had obviously excess disposable income that they could buy it with. So there was, I think, a renaissance of sorts of everybody revamping their homes, buying new cars. Everybody changed their cookware, their furniture. I think TVs. I mean, it was just across all channels. It was just like this massive renaissance at retail that I think if you look back at all the profits, I think the collapse of many of the retailers today was because of the fact that those retailers that have gone out of business, Bed Bath & Beyond and Big Lots and many of the other ones, they lost track of that. They never recovered from that. Basically, they were able to never re-get they lost those sales in essence. They could never get them back because obviously all that money went away, and and they were never able to really pivot to make the adjustments on their inventories and their store and their sales. So, there's a lot of contributing factors to that. And I think that kind of created that first inflationary pressure, right? I think
so let me ask, so let's say, here we are after COVID, right? And,
sure.
You were saying we have this situation where it was unexpected, prices, those that are still in business have adapted. Now compare that to like prior to 18, 19 when the last tariffs, came out. You said, China was emerging. There was a sort of a re-engineering. They were trying to make better
Yeah,
products, to compare the two and how you went through last year. So
sure.
how would you first of all say the world's a little different now than 2018? And then really more importantly, to the topic of the day, for whatever these tariffs that whatever they may come down, what would you, if they do come down at different elements, what would you do maybe the same as before or
I,
differently than before? And what can consumers, potentially expect?
yeah, I think that's a great question. Today, it's a little bit, I would say it's a little bit different than before. And I think that the retail landscape's a little different, and I think the manufacturing is a little different in China. A lot of our factories, and again, being specific to our industry, that make this product, post-COVID, we saw a change in the labor market in China where a lot of the of that younger generation of person graduating from college or that younger, call it that person that may not have a college degree, but they have a high school degree and they have a trade skill of some sort over there. They don't really want to work in the factories anymore. There's been a renaissance of that younger generation in China that does not, they're having a harder time getting labor in those factories. So we've seen a lot of automation. And a lot of the factories that we work with have changed completely in terms of having before that typical 100, 200, 300, 400 people work staff. They've changed a lot of that and a lot more automation, robotics coming into play. So that's made them more efficient, which has let them, maintain certain costs and they've been able to stay competitive and keep costing, I would say, comparatively low to other parts of the world. And really replace that labor that's not coming back, right? It's not that generational. I remember in a lot of the factories, initially visiting, a lot of those positions were basically passed down. Their family members would get it. If a grandfather had it, the son worked there, or the son then passed it to his son, depending on what the factory was, and they had that generational work, and that's no longer the case. A lot of the younger generation want to work in offices. They're on influencers. They're doing a bunch of other things that very common here, like to the U.S. They're tech jobs and other things that are really changing in China. So I think that's a challenge for sure. I think that there's definitely that, and they're having to replace that with robotics and other things, which in the overall grand scheme of things, it's good to expand, but it also makes it more costly to expand. You have to buy more machinery and more things. So I think that we're seeing lot versus previous and before, where a lot of manufacturing in China. I think that they're more cautious in terms of when they see optimism and their factories growing. They're probably extending lead times more to manufacture. They're not just jumping in and adding a production line and adding 50 people because they can't necessarily find them so fast. So I think that there's more of a temperament in that, and I think that changes too the dynamic of the business, because it's not like they're just jumping at the bit in a lot of cases to just, hey, let me push all these products down your throat. I have this excess manufacturing and I can do this. I think it's much more cautious and much more measured. And how that impacts us today, I guess globally, is these tariffs and these situation. There's kind of like I call it a twofold approach. When they did this new tariff that was a 10%, I guess, really across all China products, products coming in from China across all categories is what it's basically summed out to. There was one thing that I think was very positive that came in that, which was the cancellation of the minimist law. That's kind of been retracted now because, and we'll talk a little bit about that, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. There's a law that allows an exporter from China or anywhere else, basically, if your shipment value is less than $800, you don't pay any duty or tariff. And most of those that are sent are U.S. by parcel, meaning that there's an agreement between, I guess you can say, all the countries regarding typical postal service, right? It's kind of subsidized by each government. And that's how the emergence of these retailers such as Temu and Shein have grown in the US. And that's when you go onto their websites and you buy a product and it gets shipped from China and it's here like in a week, and it goes through the postal system. That type of that type of, let's say it's a distribution system basically, and it's designed to have the factories selling the consumers direct here. So in a
Mhm.
lot of cases, it's factories in China selling the customers here. They're not US based companies. The money stays in either Hong Kong or China, and typically the people are where they don't realize they're buying from there. There's
Right.
no quality control. There's no FDA. There's no Proposition 65. There's none of those controls for those products coming over. And that's a big advantage against import, against us importers and retailers where we have to pay a duty and tariff. And those costs are real costs to us that we have to pay it. But if you're shipping those products, and so it was an interesting stat when they canceled that and they halted the shipments coming over. I think overall the business, I have a note here, went down anywhere depending on the item between 16 to 41% in 1 week of
These
that.
were these
Yeah,
Chinese that are trying to go direct to consumer. They finally, when
correct.
that cracks down, they got halted almost 40%.
Almost. And then it became so overwhelming for US Customs because there was like a million packages that were sitting there trying to be processed. And we didn't even have the systems to process all those things that so quickly.
Oh,
So I think once they kind of retracted that, but I think they're going to go back to it, I'm sure soon. That will greatly impact our business in a positive way for all the retailers, importers, distributors that are here working, because I think that's going to be that's business that we're losing. And to give you an idea, it's people don't understand the magnitude of it. I have a friend who has a factory who they do hydration mugs like Stanleys and Yetis and that type of product, right? They send per day 16,000 pieces of mugs to the US through that system in a small little
wow.
box. So that's one guy, 16,000 pieces a day, put that 5 days a week, 52 weeks of the year. That's taking away from all of us here. And it's just because they can ship an item for 20 bucks.
Mhm.
And that includes the duty, it includes the shipping, it includes everything because it's subsidized from A to B. And I think that that's our economy for sure, at least from a retailer and importer perspective. And I think as an industry, we're definitely behind that law uh, being hopefully restarted again, and that they once they get settled on how to collect the duties and the tariffs on that, and they can actually collect them, I think it's going to change the whole dynamic of it so much that if I saw an article on Reuters the other day, that they're thinking about like a lot of the factories. Timo is trying to offer money for the factories to move to Cambodia and Vietnam and other countries to restart over there because they're afraid that their business will basically dismantle within a month or two. So
Wow.
there's a lot of action happening on that, which I think will be good for retail. I think we need it as an industry, but that was one of the positives that came out of that. And I think as an industry and a retail industry, everybody's very behind it. And that will help us because it really gets us on an even playing field. And that's taking away not only from the people may say, oh, it's just, it's an advantage, but it's really a safety concern. And I always say, we have to
Absolutely.
follow all these requirements and we have to, test products before they go. We have to have, FDA requirements, Prop 65. We have to have so many different laws. The whole PFAS thing that's happening in the US now, the movement against PFAS, which we're very, very involved with, and getting all that out of the products and changing materials and coatings and all these different things where they really have no regulation on that. They can ship you whatever they want and there's no recourse, zero. There's no one to go to. There's no one to talk to. There's no one to claim to. So I think that's going to be not only for the safety and well-being of the consumers in the US, that's a big thing. So that's like number one. Now, the second part of that is that 10%, right? That everybody's talking about and how much it's going to impact. I think that 10%, in my humble and honest opinion, the consumer will not see it. I think that will be negotiated through the supply chain. And what do I mean by that? I think that retailers will have a staunch approach to say, which they have already, hey, we're not going to take any increases. We want to mitigate that 100%. Obviously, they're communicating this to all the importers, distributors, brands that sell to them. And on their case, they're probably going back to the manufacturers and saying, hey, you got to absorb that 10% increase. So what's going to happen is in the next several weeks, because China's just really returning from Chinese New Year, and the factories, most of them aren't even back yet working. Over the next several weeks, I'm sure there'll be heavy conversations, and we've already been involved in many, going back to those factories and saying, hey, listen, what is it that you, from, at a top line level, what do you think you have in your supply chain that you can save? And it usually starts with raw materials, packaging, how you can make the product cheaper, in the sense that, hey, if instead of I'm going to order from you 5,000 pieces this month, and I'm going to order 5,000 at a time, I'm going to run a production of 15,000, and we're going to ship them in 2 months versus 3 months,
Let
right?
me ask
So you,
Manny, because you
sure.
said they went to automation, right? They have these robots. That automation, while there's some upfront costs, that should have also be keeping their margins pretty high, so they would potentially be able to absorb a little bit of
True,
this.
true. But remember, they're also tied to, in their defense, they're tied to whatever commodity prices they can buy at, right?
Right.
They're tied to the local market. They can't go to the US or Italy or anywhere else. They're not going to find a better price on raw materials. So you'll start finding, I think, that they will also give in margin. They're going to
Yeah.
give their margin. And it's going to be based on a supply chain. It's going to be negotiated freight rates. I think that everybody's going to have to go back to the well and figure out how they can save on costs. And I think there'll be some absorption on, every importer or distributor, or retailer for that matter, just absorbing some percentage of cost. And I think the last bit, which we don't know yet, and I've talked to several different people overseas, and I've been listening to a lot of different podcasts and just interviews about, will China go back to that devaluation again, and how they're going to do it? And there's a lot of opinions. Some are saying nothing's going to happen. Some are saying it's going to happen over a period of time, that it may be 2, 3, 4, 5 months that they take it. The average concession, I think I have wrote it down here. It's somewhere between a 3 to 4% is what people are talking about, and those economists that are out there discussing that as a possibility. But it's too soon to tell.
Yeah.
I think that in the short term, I think retailers, importers, distributors, and factories across will all absorb that in the supply chain. I don't see it just being passed on to the consumer.
Yeah, that's a great point, Manny. And let me ask you, do you notice any similarities or differences? Because you said last time it's very product specific. Is it looking different this time than last time, or does it seem to be the
This
same
time it's a broad
products?
brush. It's very different. It's a broad brush. It's like 10%
Every
across
product,
everything.
everything.
Everything. Everything. So there's some items, for example, that have never experienced this. So for example, festive decorations like Christmas items and articles have never had any type of duty or tariff. It's a minimal thing. It's a processing fee. It's like a couple of percents, 1 or 2%. They're going to have a 10% now. So those factories for the first time are having to engage in this, where many of the other factories are used to this, right? So I think it's like everything in life, right? Once you've experienced it, you have a better way to handle it. They have a better, they have a better temperament to it. They're more open to it. Whereas the factories that have never had to deal with this are like, oh my God, I've never had to deal with this before. And they may or may not have the margin for it. They may or may not have been expecting it. So it's a little bit different negotiation in that sense. But I
That's
think
really
overall
interesting. Yeah.
there's more of I think for a 10% value, um, it's going to be absorbed through the chain. I was
Yeah.
sharing with a retailer just yesterday that they were, we're in this negotiation process, and I'm like, man, it could have been a heck of a lot easier if it would have been 25. We wouldn't be talking about this right now. And they're like, oh, don't say that. I'm like, yeah, but we wouldn't be sitting here arguing over 2 or 3%, right? So I
Yeah.
get in the bright side of it. I think that it'll just be absorbed through the chain. Now, something I can just at a top level comment on, and I don't really have the specifics, like on a lot of the raw materials you're talking about, like aluminum and steel, that will have some type of impact. I don't see how you can mitigate 25%. I think on big ticket items, like they're talking about, that will be offset with what you can make here too, and some of the other things. But that will take a little bit more time, because I think those type of products take a lot longer in the supply chain. So I don't think those are immediate increases. When you look at raw materials from a raw material standpoint, that's what they're talking about. That's going to have a different effect going down the supply chain, and that's going to be, there's so many different things that those products, like the automakers are talking about it, and some of them, it could be a brake pad, or it could be a brake, a rotor. I mean, there's so many different things, but when you look at the components of those things, it's really on a case by case basis, because
Yeah.
maybe that raw material is only 30% of that component cost, right? So it's only 25% of 30% in 100% value. So it may only equate to 7 or 8% cost, right? Versus if you're buying Windows today and your manufacturer from Windows is buying it from China versus somewhere else, it may be more. But those are the things that we don't know. You know
That's
what I
really
mean?
interesting. Yeah, it's really
Yeah,
interesting, Manny, and it's nice. It's interesting. Like you said, there could be positive that are coming out of these industries and these products that haven't been
sure.
tariffed in the past. Like you say, they could be re-engineered to a higher level. And it's really interesting what you said about that law and these people that are shipping directly to consumers. It's funny.
Yeah.
This camera that I'm talking to you on, it came from China. It was unexpected. Honestly, I forgot I ordered it because it took like 3 weeks to come over. Right. And so like if you're really concerned about this, right, the tariffs and like buy America and all that same concept, we got to be very careful of where we're buying from and right and try to see that and going through that. So Manny,
Listen,
listen,
it's a battle in my household too. Trust me. And my wife, I'm like, stop buying from those places. I go, you don't even know what we're getting. I mean,
but we didn't know we were buying from them.
right. I mean, the
Yeah.
reality is nobody knows. And it's kind
Yeah.
of like that. It's a mass thing. But like I share, is it's so much better to buy from US retailers. And the reason why is A, there's accountability. You have someone that you can go back to either return it, or if something from a safety standpoint happens, you can always talk to them and there's always a solution for that, right? And B, you know that the quality and the metrics and the standards are being reviewed on a constant basis, whether it's the company doing it themselves, the people who make it for that company, or it's just customs in itself that you get random holds and they go ahead and they test your products and you have to submit reports and they come into your warehouse and they check them for lead and cadmium and all these different things. So, there's no control of that,
Yeah.
when you're buying it from these places direct. And that's something to be,
That's a great
to be
point.
said,
That's a
you
great
know,
point, Manny, because people like they want to buy US and let's make it more simple. Buy from a US retailer, right? Because wherever
100%.
it might be
Forget where it's
sourced,
made,
forget
US
where it's made,
retailer.
just comes to US.
Right.
I think that's a really great point, and I think that's
Yeah.
one we can end on here. But Manny, this has been really awesome, my friend. That's been really
Thank
educational to
you.
me, and I really hope anybody out there that's listening to this finds that beneficial. We'll put the information on you and your company. Maybe people will want to follow up with you and ask questions, wherever it might be. But this has been
Sure.
awesome. Thanks so much, my friend.
No, thanks for your time, and it's great to talk about these things, it's current events, and break it down to where people can understand a little bit easier that it's these are the real world happenings that us importers deal with. So yeah, thanks. Great podcast. Looking forward to maybe a follow up once this is all said and done. We can go back and hash out and see what the end result was.
No, dude, for your first time on, dude, I couldn't shut you down, dude. You were in there. You were going. But listen, buddy, we'll talk soon.
Thanks, man.